In 1969, inside a New York boardroom, Avery Fisher handed over the keys to the company that bore his name. He sold Fisher Radio to Emerson, setting off a chain reaction of corporate consolidation that would eventually hand the brand to Sanyo. The consequence was absolute. Walk into an American discount department store in the 1980s, and you would find the Fisher badge stamped onto hollow, black plastic rack systems stacked near the checkout lines. The paradox was staggering. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. In the mid-1960s, a Fisher receiver was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the American living room. It was an uncompromising instrument of glowing vacuum tubes, brushed aluminum, and rich walnut, hand-wired in Long Island City and housed in cabinets built in Milroy, Pennsylvania. To own a Fisher 500C was to own the absolute pinnacle of FM stereo broadcasting. The name engraved on the tuning dial was not decoration. It was a promise that the music pulled from the air would sound exactly as the broadcast engineer intended. But the real story of Fisher Radio is not merely the story of a luxury brand degrading into department store plastic. It is the story of the American high-fidelity dream colliding with the modern electronics market. It is the story of what happened when the heavy, expensive perfection of American tube engineering was forced to compete with the lightweight, solid-state efficiency of imported transistor receivers. The listener did not stop tuning in to FM stereo. The habit remained, but the economic reality underneath the tuning dial had fundamentally changed. Every week, we tell the stories of American radios, FM stations, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard music and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in New York, in 1937. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in New York, in 1937. At that time, the American living room was dominated by the console radio. These were massive, ornate pieces of furniture, often standing waist-high in the corner of a room, built by national manufacturing giants like RCA, Zenith, and Philco. They were proud status symbols for families recovering from the Great Depression. But there was a fundamental problem hidden behind their elaborate wooden grills. The sound was inherently compromised. The American radio market was built entirely on AM radio, amplitude modulation broadcasting, a radio system that changes signal strength to carry sound over long distances. AM was perfect for sending a president's fireside chat or a distant baseball broadcast across state lines, but it was physically limited in its frequency response. The audio was muddy, narrow, and plagued by atmospheric static. Furthermore, the massive loudspeakers inside these consoles were housed in booming, resonant wooden cabinets that turned bass notes into a muffled, vibrating roar. The American listener had accepted this limitation. They believed that a radio was supposed to sound like a radio, a box emitting voices, not like a live orchestra playing in the room. Avery Fisher did not accept it. He was an amateur violinist, an acoustics enthusiast, and a book designer working in New York City. When he listened to live music at Carnegie Hall, he heard crisp highs, distinct individual instruments, and a wide, dynamic soundstage. When he went home and turned on a commercial radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, he heard a compressed, lifeless imitation of that performance. Fisher decided to fix the problem himself. In 1937, he founded Philharmonic Radio in New York. His goal was not to build another piece of mass-market furniture. His goal was to build an instrument capable of true high fidelity. The concept of high fidelity barely existed in the American consumer consciousness in the late 1930s. Selling it was a monumental risk. Philharmonic Radio targeted a very specific, wealthy clientele. Fisher built custom, heavy, incredibly expensive receiver chassis that prioritized advanced circuit design and premium vacuum tubes, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced them. A Philharmonic receiver could cost upwards of $400, placing it completely out of reach for the average American family, costing as much as a new automobile. But the gamble proved something vital. There was a quiet, desperate market for perfect sound. Radio engineers, classical music enthusiasts, and wealthy audiophiles heard Fisher's custom creations and realized that broadcasting did not have to sound muddy. He proved that if the engineering was uncompromising, the radio could faithfully recreate the concert hall. Then, World War II halted all domestic consumer electronics production. When the war ended, the American market shifted dramatically. In 1945, Avery Fisher sold his interest in Philharmonic and started over. He founded the Fisher Radio Corporation, setting up fresh operations in New York. The timing was critical. Millions of returning soldiers, booming suburban housing, and a newly affluent middle class were about to transform the American living room. More importantly, a new technology was slowly emerging from experimental status into the commercial light: FM radio. FM radio, frequency modulation broadcasting, a radio system that changes signal frequency to carry clearer sound over shorter distances, was an absolute revelation. Unlike AM, FM was inherently resistant to static and electrical interference. It had a much wider frequency response. It could carry the sparkling highs of a violin string and the deep, clean resonance of a cello without distortion. But to hear what FM could really do, the American listener needed a receiver capable of reproducing it. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Fisher focused heavily on separate audio components. Instead of selling a single massive console, Fisher sold distinct, specialized pieces: a standalone tuner to catch the broadcast, a separate preamplifier to shape the tone, and a heavy, heat-generating power amplifier to drive the loudspeakers, the parts of a radio system that turn the electrical signal into sound moving through air. This strategy effectively birthed the American audiophile culture. A Fisher tuner sitting on a custom bookshelf became the mark of an educated, affluent listener. But component audio was inherently complicated. It required complex wiring, matching electrical impedances between components and dedicated shelf space. It was intimidating to the average American consumer who simply wanted to listen to a symphony after dinner. Fisher realized that to truly conquer the American market, he could not just sell complex equipment to engineers and dedicated hobbyists. He had to bring high-fidelity performance into the suburban living room without requiring the homeowner to understand electronics. He began integrating his premium circuits into a single chassis. The high-fidelity receiver was born. It combined the sensitive FM tuner, the precise preamplifier, and the powerful vacuum tube amplifier into one beautiful, heavy, metal and glass unit. It was plug-and-play perfection. The demand was immediate. By the late 1950s, Fisher Radio Corporation was no longer a boutique New York operation. It was a highly respected American electronics manufacturer. When a consumer saw the iconic Fisher Bird logo on a brushed aluminum faceplate in a high-end Main Street electronics store, they knew they were looking at domestic engineering at its finest. The tuning dial felt heavy and precise. The glow of the tubes promised warmth. But the true test was yet to come. The Federal Communications Commission, the government agency that grants the FCC license allowing a station to broadcast on a specific frequency, was preparing to authorize a new broadcasting standard that would change American music forever. The Fisher factories were running at full capacity, building some of the most complex consumer electronics in the world. The brand was established. The reputation was flawless. But to build an empire, Avery Fisher now had to prove his machines could master the next revolution in sound. The true test for Avery Fisher's empire did not come from the AM dial. It came from a regulatory decision in Washington that would permanently change how America listened to music. In April 1961, the Federal Communications Commission approved a national standard for FM stereo broadcasting. Until that moment, FM radio, frequency modulation broadcasting, had been an impressive but strictly monaural medium. It offered static-free sound and a wide frequency response, but it carried only a single channel of audio. The new FCC rule allowed radio stations to broadcast FM multiplex, a system that carried both left and right audio channels over a single radio wave. For the American listener, this was a revelation. It meant that a person sitting on their living room sofa no longer heard a symphony orchestra pushed through a single point in the center of the room. They heard the violins distinctly on the left and the brass section on the right. The physical boundaries of the room seemed to disappear. Fisher Radio was uniquely positioned to capitalize on this shift. They had already mastered the integrated receiver, combining the tuner, preamplifier, and amplifier into one chassis. Now, they just had to master stereo. In 1964, Fisher released a machine that would define the American audiophile era, the Fisher 500C. The 500C was a massive 38-pound instrument. The faceplate was thick, brushed aluminum, dominated by a long, illuminated glass tuning dial. Inside the heavy chassis, 19 vacuum tubes, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals, glowed with intense heat. The heart of the machine was its tuning capacitor, a precise mechanical component that changed the circuit's tuning so the radio could select one specific station from the crowded airwaves. When an American homeowner grabbed the solid metal tuning knob of a 500C, it did not spin loosely like a cheap kitchen radio. It was heavily weighted. As the needle glided smoothly across the dial, a magic eye tube, a small green visual indicator, would close when the signal was perfectly locked. And then, a red light labeled stereo beacon would illuminate. In the mid-1960s, that glowing red light was a status symbol. It meant the household was receiving the absolute cutting edge of American broadcasting. But this level of engineering was not a casual purchase. In 1964, the Fisher 500C retailed for roughly $369, before the cost of the optional wooden cabinet, and before the required loudspeakers and turntable. In modern currency, it was a multi-thousand-dollar investment. You did not buy a Fisher at a corner hardware store. It was sold in premium audio salons, places like Harvey Radio on 45th Street in Manhattan, or specialized Main Street electronics dealers where salesmen in suits demonstrated the equipment in acoustically treated sound rooms. The breakthrough of the 500C was not just its ability to receive a stereo signal. It was the sheer power and warmth of its delivery. The receiver utilized 47591 output tubes, delivering roughly 30 watts per channel. While vacuum tubes generated massive heat, required heavy iron transformers, and consumed significant electricity, they possessed a sonic signature that early solid-state devices could not replicate. They provided a natural, warm compression that made radio announcers sound like they were sitting in the room and made string instruments sound physically alive. The machine was immediately recognized as an engineering triumph. Trade journals like Audio and High Fidelity magazine praised its sensitivity, how well the radio picked up weak signals from distant transmitters, and its selectivity, how well it separated one station from another nearby on the dial. The 500C was so accurate that local FM station engineers often used Fisher receivers in their own control booths to monitor how their broadcasts sounded over the air. Fisher also understood that a premium radio required a premium service network, the shops, technicians, and repair counters that kept radios working after the sale. They provided service manuals that looked like engineering textbooks. The internal layout of the 500C was logical and meticulously hand-wired. When a capacitor, a component that stores and releases electrical energy, eventually failed, A local technician could easily trace the schematic, unsolder the part, and replace it. It was a machine designed to be maintained, not discarded. Fisher's ultimate American moat was the integration of extreme technical capability with luxury aesthetics. A Fisher receiver did not look like cold laboratory equipment. It was designed to sit proudly next to the good crystal, the hardcover books, and the mid-century furniture. Avery Fisher had solved the problem of the American living room. He had taken the intimidating, wire-tangled world of component hi-fi and put it into a single, beautiful, reliable box. The name on the dial was no longer just a brand. It was a guarantee about reception, but keeping that guarantee required a massive, expensive American manufacturing machine that now had to be fed. By 1965, Fisher Radio was no longer just a successful electronics company. It was a vertically integrated American manufacturing empire dedicated entirely to the perfection of the FM stereo signal. At its peak, the company was a magnificent, heavy industry machine operating at full throttle, turning raw metal, glass, and wood into the most coveted radio receivers in the world. The heart of this empire was the massive Fisher manufacturing facility in Long Island City, New York. Inside this plant, hundreds of skilled American technicians and assembly workers built the complex chassis of the 500C and its sister models. This was not the automated robotic assembly of the modern era. It was a deeply physical, labor-intensive process. Fisher relied heavily on point-to-point wiring, a meticulous construction method where workers manually routed and soldered individual wires directly between tube sockets, resistors, and switches. The physical weight of a Fisher receiver was an undeniable part of its authority. A significant portion of that weight came from its massive power and audio output transformers, heavy blocks of iron and wrapped copper wire designed to step down wall voltage to feed the glowing vacuum tubes, and to ensure the audio signal remained pure before it traveled to the loudspeakers. When a delivery driver carried a boxed Fisher receiver up the steps of an American suburban home, they felt the absolute density of the engineering. But Avery Fisher knew that a tangle of exposed metal, glass tubes, and iron transformers belonged in a laboratory, not a mid-century modern living room. To bridge the gap between industrial broadcasting equipment and domestic luxury, Fisher maintained a dedicated woodworking factory in Milroy, Pennsylvania. The Milroy plant did not build basic plastic shells. It operated like a high-end American furniture maker. Skilled carpenters crafted thick, acoustically inert cabinets from premium walnut and mahogany veneers. These cabinets were designed specifically to house the hot, heavy receiver chassis. The wood was sanded, stained, and finished to match the most expensive domestic credenzas and bookshelves of the era. The contrast was striking: a faceplate of cold, brushed aluminum and glowing glass, wrapped in the deep, organic warmth of Pennsylvania walnut. This uncompromising manufacturing philosophy dictated exactly where and how Fisher products were sold. You could not buy a Fisher 500C at a standard hardware store, nor could you find it in the discount aisles of a mail-order catalog. Fisher receivers were sold through a carefully curated network of prestige electronics retailers and dedicated, high-fidelity audio salons. In places like Harvey Radio in Manhattan, or in specialized Main Street audio shops across the American suburbs, the purchasing experience was treated with immense gravity. Salesmen wore suits and ties. They guided affluent customers into acoustically treated demonstration rooms. They would switch between a standard AM broadcast on a cheaper radio and a live FM stereo broadcast on a Fisher 500C, letting the customer hear the dramatic, undeniable difference in clarity, depth, and physical presence. The Fisher was not sold as a simple radio. It was sold as a lifetime investment in acoustic truth. For the affluent American family in 1965, a Fisher receiver sitting in the center of the living room was the ultimate cultural hearth. This was the stakes sentence. The glowing tuning dial of the 500C was the trusted physical anchor that brought the local symphony, the jazz club, and the emerging FM stereo DJ directly into the home with absolute, static-free clarity. When a father turned the heavy, weighted tuning knob on a Sunday evening, the family did not just hear a broadcast, they felt the acoustic dimensions of the studio space miles away. The American listener had been trained by Fisher to expect perfection, and the company was delivering it by the thousands. They held a dominant market share in the premium receiver category, and their brand name was universally recognized as the gold standard of American audio. But maintaining this standard required a massive, unyielding economic machine. Fisher was paying New York manufacturing wages, sourcing premium American components, and absorbing the immense shipping costs of moving 40-pound wooden and iron receivers across the country. The machine was operating flawlessly, but the global market surrounding it was already preparing a quiet, devastating technological shift. By the latter half of the 1960s, the American FM dial itself was undergoing a radical transformation, pulling Fisher Radio to its absolute commercial zenith. The catalyst was a regulatory mandate from Washington. In 1964, the Federal Communications Commission ruled that broadcasters in major American markets could no longer simulcast, broadcast the exact same programming on both their AM and FM frequencies for more than half the day. FM stations were suddenly forced to develop original, independent programming to fill the airwaves. This regulatory shift birthed an entirely new American listening culture. AM remained the home of quick news bulletins and 3-minute pop singles, but FM stations began experimenting with long-form classical music performances, high-fidelity jazz, and the deep, uninterrupted album cuts of underground rock. This new audio landscape demanded better hardware. Listeners realized that to truly experience the layered production of a modern stereo album broadcast over the air, they needed the clarity and separation of the FM band. And for those who could afford the very best equipment to capture that signal, the upgrade path led directly to Fisher. The scale of the operation reached staggering heights. By 1968, Fisher Radio Corporation was generating over $30 million in annual revenue. The product line had expanded from the legendary 500C to an entire ecosystem of high-end audio components, including the 400 and the immensely powerful 800 series. The supply chain required to feed this demand was a marvel of domestic manufacturing. Boxcars of premium wood veneer rolled into the Milroy cabinet plant. Miles of copper wire, thousands of heavy iron transformers, and countless glass vacuum tubes were delivered weekly to the Long Island City assembly lines. Avery Fisher himself was known to walk the factory floor, randomly pulling units off the line to personally test their tuning meters and listen to their stereo separation. To open the pages of Stereo Review or High Fidelity magazine during this era was to see Fisher treated as the undisputed benchmark of American acoustic engineering. The company was so confident in its market position that it published a comprehensive, hardcover-style guidebook called the Fisher Handbook. They distributed hundreds of thousands of copies to educate the American public on how to properly set up a home stereo system, explaining speaker placement and antenna alignment. Fisher was no longer just selling a radio receiver, they were dictating the culture of American listening. During these peak years, Fisher also began navigating the early transition to the transistor, a tiny solid-state component that amplified signals with less heat and power than a vacuum tube. Early solid-state audio from other brands was notoriously harsh and fatiguing, but Fisher engineers painstakingly voiced their new transistor receivers, like the 500T, to mimic the warm, rich sound of their classic tube designs. They proved that a receiver could run cooler and weigh slightly less, while still carrying the unmistakable acoustic signature of a New York-built machine. In a late 1960s suburban den, The ritual of listening was sacred. A homeowner would slide a heavy Fisher receiver into its Pennsylvania walnut cabinet, secure the connections on the rear terminal strip, and carefully align the FM antenna. When they turned the heavy, weighted aluminum dial, the tuning meter would swing perfectly into place, locking onto a distant stereo signal with zero background hiss. It was an era when listening to an FM broadcast was not a background activity. It was the primary event of the evening. The music filled the room with a physical presence that commanded absolute attention. But that physical presence carried an immense industrial burden. The American radio market was beginning to fracture. While Fisher was perfecting the expensive art of domestic receiver manufacturing, utilizing highly paid New York labor and Pennsylvania woodworkers, a new wave of competitors was studying their blueprints. The machine was still working flawlessly. The brand held absolute trust. But the financial gravity of building uncompromising audio equipment on American soil was about to reach its breaking point. The first small crack in the Fisher empire did not happen on a retail showroom floor. It happened on an engineering bench deep inside the Long Island City factory in the late 1960s. The global audio industry was undergoing a seismic, irreversible shift away from the vacuum tube and toward the transistor. For decades, tubes had provided the warm, rich sound that defined American high fidelity. But they were inherently flawed for mass market expansion. They generated massive amounts of heat, consumed heavy electrical current, and eventually burned out, requiring the owner to frequently visit a local repair shop or drugstore to test and replace them. The transistor, a tiny, solid-state electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with a fraction of the heat and power, promised a future of cool, reliable, and compact receivers. But transitioning an entire manufacturing philosophy from tubes to solid state was a brutal, incredibly expensive undertaking. Fisher had built its reputation on meticulous, point-to-point hand wiring. Solid-state technology required printed circuit boards carrying tiny electronic components and flat copper tracks that connect them. To maintain their prestige as the absolute best in American audio, Fisher attempted to build premium solid-state receivers domestically. Models like the 250-T and the sophisticated 500-TX were engineering marvels, integrating early automated station-seeking features. They were brilliant machines. They were also the beginning of a mathematical trap. The structural forces of the American market were turning against domestic electronics manufacturing. The costs of American labor, premium components, and domestic shipping were rising sharply. Producing a massive heavy receiver in New York, wrapping it in a custom walnut cabinet in Pennsylvania, and shipping it to California was becoming financially unsustainable. Fisher was forced to price their solid-state receivers at an absolute premium just to maintain their margins. That high price point created an opening, and a new wave of competitors immediately flooded through it. By the late 1960s, a fleet of Japanese audio manufacturers, companies like Pioneer, Sansui, and Kenwood, were arriving at American ports. They had completely mastered solid-state technology. Unburdened by the legacy costs of tube manufacturing, these overseas companies utilized highly efficient, automated assembly lines and lower-cost labor. They were not exporting cheap, flimsy, portable radios. They were exporting massive, beautiful, silver-faced stereo receivers that delivered immense wattage, ran perfectly cool, and cost significantly less than a domestic Fisher. Imagine an American electronics showroom in 1968. A customer walks in, looking to upgrade their home audio system to capture the new, underground FM rock stations. On one shelf sits a Fisher solid-state receiver, prestigious, elegant, but carrying a daunting price tag. Right next to it sits a newly imported Japanese receiver, boasting more power per channel, a sleek blackout tuning dial, and a retail price that leaves the buyer with enough leftover cash to purchase a new turntable and a pair of loudspeakers. The listener did not stop wanting high-fidelity FM stereo. They simply chose the more efficient, affordable path to get it. Avery Fisher was a brilliant acoustic engineer, but he was also a pragmatic businessman. He looked at the inescapable gravity of the global supply chain and realized that the era of the hand-wired, uncompromising American luxury receiver was mathematically ending. He could either watch his company slowly suffocate under its own manufacturing weight, or he could exit at the absolute peak of his brand's value. In 1969, Fisher made the decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of his namesake. He sold Fisher Radio to Emerson Electric for nearly $31 million. Emerson, a massive American industrial conglomerate, publicly promised to maintain Fisher's legendary high standards. But the realities of corporate consolidation and retail price pressure were merciless. To compete with the relentless influx of Japanese imports, Emerson began to quietly look for ways to trim manufacturing costs. The heavy iron transformers grew slightly lighter. The thick, brushed aluminum faceplates grew a fraction of an inch thinner. The meticulous, over-engineered internal layouts began to look more like standard mass production. The radio still worked. The tuning dial still locked onto a signal. The brand name still carried a massive aura of public trust. But the machine behind the badge was fundamentally changing. The American high-fidelity fortress had been breached, not by inferior sound, but by the overwhelming efficiency of the global market. But the Emerson acquisition was merely a holding pattern. The true, absolute dismantling of the Fisher legacy would arrive a few years later, delivered by the very overseas competitors they had tried to outrun. Emerson Electric held on to Fisher for only a few short years. They quickly realized that competing in the brutal 1970s audio receiver market against Japanese giants like Yamaha, Pioneer, and Marantz required a level of specialized, high-volume global manufacturing they were not prepared to build. In 1975, Emerson made a strictly financial decision. They sold the Fisher brand to Sanyo, a massive Japanese electronics conglomerate. Sanyo did not purchase Fisher to revive the Long Island City assembly lines. They did not buy the company to build heavy, hand-wired chassis or to source premium Pennsylvania walnut. Sanyo bought the badge. They wanted a recognizable, trusted American name to stamp onto their own mass-market audio equipment. This was the beginning of catastrophic brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity. Under Sanyo, all remaining American manufacturing was completely shut down. The New York engineers, the assembly line workers, and the Milroy cabinet makers were dismissed. The entire production chain was relocated overseas to highly automated, cost-optimized factories. The Fisher name was systematically stripped of its geographic and engineering soul. By the early 1980s, the American retail landscape had shifted dramatically. The dedicated, high-end audio salons, with their acoustically treated demonstration rooms and knowledgeable salesmen, were being squeezed out of the market. They were replaced by massive big-box electronics retailers, regional discount department stores, and catalog showrooms. These new retail environments did not want to sell complex individual audio components that required careful setup. They wanted to sell complete single-box solutions that looked visually impressive on a showroom floor, but cost very little to produce and ship. Sanyo transformed the Fisher brand to meet this exact retail demand. The result was the 1980s Fisher rack system. If the Fisher 500C of the 1960s was an instrument of acoustic precision, the 1980s Fisher rack system was an exercise in pure visual illusion. To a consumer walking through the center aisle of a Sears or Montgomery Ward, the system looked like a towering professional audio rig. It featured a turntable, an AM/FM tuner, a dual cassette deck, an amplifier, and a glowing graphic equalizer, all stacked vertically inside a tall cabinet with a glass door, flanked by two enormous loudspeakers. But the physical reality of the machine was completely hollow. The seemingly separate components were often just a single cheap printed circuit board hidden behind a unified front panel of molded black plastic, stamped with faux metallic lines to simulate stacked units. The heavy, weighted aluminum tuning knobs that once glided across glass dials were gone. They were replaced by flimsy plastic buttons and cheap digital preset switches that felt loose and hollow to the touch. The internal engineering suffered a devastating downgrade. The heavy iron transformers and meticulous discrete transistors were replaced by cheap, integrated circuits. When a local FM station broadcast the heavily synthesized, aggressively compressed pop music of the 1980s, these cheap amplifiers produced harsh, fatiguing audio that distorted wildly when pushed to high volumes. The magnificent Pennsylvania walnut cabinets were replaced by thin vinyl-wrapped particle board that chipped easily at the corners. Even the massive loudspeakers were a deception. They featured thin stamped metal frames and lightweight magnets that lacked any real acoustic depth or bass response. Furthermore, Sanyo's manufacturing approach completely destroyed Fisher's legendary service network. When a 1960s tube receiver failed, a local Main Street technician could open the heavy chassis, trace the schematic, and solder in a new capacitor. When a 1980s Fisher rack system stopped working, usually because a cheap plastic gear in the cassette deck snapped, or a fragile digital tuner button broke, it was practically unrepairable. The plastic casing was not designed to be opened. The machine was simply unplugged, carried out to the curb, and thrown into the garbage. The American market had shifted entirely from a repair culture to a replacement culture. Yet despite the absolute degradation of the hardware, the Sanyo-era Fisher rack systems sold by the millions. They were heavily promoted in Sunday newspaper circulars and stacked high on wooden pallets near the checkout lines. A teenager in 1985 could use their summer job savings to buy a massive Fisher stereo for their bedroom, completely unaware that the name on the plastic badge had once represented the absolute pinnacle of American acoustic engineering. The global market had chosen extreme volume and visual flash over fidelity. The Fisher brand became incredibly profitable for Sanyo during this era, but it survived as an empty shell. It became synonymous with the disposable, low-quality consumer electronics boom of the late 20th century. Serious audiophiles and radio enthusiasts learned to actively avoid anything bearing the Fisher name that was built after the Emerson sale. Eventually, even the illusion of the rack system could not survive. As the 1990s approached, consumer tastes shifted again, moving toward compact CD boomboxes, and eventually, digital MP3s and smartphones. Sanyo gradually phased out the Fisher name entirely, retiring it to the archives of corporate trademarks, leaving behind nothing but millions of tons of black plastic in American landfills. The New York factory was empty. The Pennsylvania wood shop was silent. The heavy tuning dials were gone. The repair manuals were discarded. The plastic cracked. The badge meant nothing. The radio was thrown away. The corporate entity, known as Fisher Radio, officially vanished into the filing cabinets of global business. Sanyo, the Japanese conglomerate that had purchased the brand and degraded it into plastic rack systems, was itself eventually absorbed by Panasonic in 2011. The Fisher trademark was quietly retired, ending a decades-long decline that had systematically erased one of the most prestigious names in American electronics. But while the corporate brand died a slow, undignified death, the original machines Avery Fisher built refused to disappear. Today, across the United States, there is a massive and highly dedicated preservation culture centered entirely around 1950s and 1960s Fisher tube audio. Vintage radio collectors, broadcast engineers, and amateur audiophiles actively hunt for surviving original New York-built equipment. They scour estate sales, thrift stores, Craigslist advertisements, and online auction sites, searching for the heavy, aluminum-faced chassis that were once the centerpiece of the American mid-century living room. When a collector finds an original Fisher 500C sitting abandoned in a suburban basement, they do not see a piece of obsolete technology. They see a machine waiting to be resurrected. The American radio repair culture, the community of technicians who keep mid-century electronics alive, has meticulously documented every circuit and schematic of the classic Fisher lineup. On dedicated vintage audio forums, restorers trade advice on how to test original vacuum tubes, how to clean the heavy mechanical tuning dials, and how to safely replace the old electrolytic capacitors, vital components that store and release electrical energy, which tend to dry out and fail after 50 years. This preservation effort is not driven by simple nostalgia. The original Fisher receiver still matters today for a deeply functional reason. In an era dominated by heavily compressed streaming audio, digital podcasts, and sterile smartphone outputs, the analog warmth of a Fisher vacuum tube amplifier provides an acoustic presence that modern solid-state receivers struggle to match. When an audiophile connects a restored Fisher 500C to a pair of modern high-end loudspeakers, the parts of a radio system that physically push air to create sound, the resulting audio is startlingly lifelike. The heavy iron transformers and glowing glass tubes naturally compress and sweeten the signal. They give the music a physical weight, proving that Avery Fisher's original engineering philosophy was fundamentally correct. The machine survived. The man's most visible monument, however, did not. In 1973, 4 years after selling his company to Emerson, Avery Fisher used a portion of his immense wealth to make a $10.5 million donation to the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York. In recognition of his gift, Philharmonic Hall was officially renamed Avery Fisher Hall. For decades, it seemed his legacy was permanently etched in gold letters onto the facade of a great American cultural institution, even as his radio brand was being stamped onto cheap plastic in discount department stores. But the modern market is an unsentimental machine. By 2014, the Lincoln Center desperately needed $500 million for a massive architectural renovation. To raise the capital, they needed to sell the naming rights to the hall again. The institution approached the Fisher family and negotiated a $15 million payment for the legal permission to drop Avery Fisher's name. In 2015, the building was officially renamed David Geffen Hall, honoring a new entertainment billionaire. The Fisher name was physically chiseled off the New York skyline. The erasure was absolute. The Long Island City manufacturing plant was gone. The Milroy cabinet factory was closed. The brand name had been diluted into meaninglessness. And finally, the concert hall bearing his name had been sold to the highest bidder. History suggests that an American radio empire cannot survive purely on its engineering merits. The market does not care about the physical weight of a tuning knob, the meticulous routing of point-to-point wiring, or the acoustic truth of a vacuum tube. The market rewards volume, distribution, and the relentless lowering of manufacturing costs. Avery Fisher tried to balance the absolute perfection of American acoustic design with the brutal mathematics of global retail, and the mathematics eventually won. But a corporate trademark and a building's facade are just legal fictions. The physical object remains the final truth. Somewhere in a suburban American garage, a technician turns on a soldering iron, watching the glass tubes of a 1964 Fisher 500C begin to glow warm orange in the dim light, preparing to pull one more perfect FM signal from the dark air. See you in the next video.